Westeros begins long before the Iron Throne, before the Targaryens, and even before most of the kingdoms people usually remember. Its history matters because nearly every feud, succession crisis, and alliance in the present day is built on decisions made thousands of years earlier. The first turning point is simple: the land was not always ruled by humans. The children of the forest and the giants came first. Then the first men crossed the arm of dawn and changed everything through war, settlement, and survival. From there, Westeros becomes a record of one conquest after another. The first men settle, the children resist, and eventually peace is only possible through the pact. Later comes the Long Night, the rise of the Night's Watch, and the first great division between the North and the rest of the continent. After that, the story keeps shifting through new powers, new crowns, and new bloodlines, until the world of Game of Thrones is shaped by conflicts that began in the oldest age of all. With the first men settled across the continent, the story of Westeros stops being about arrival and becomes about adjustment. They did not walk into an empty land. The children of the forest already knew the woods, the rivers, the hills, and the strange rhythms of the old world. The first men brought bronze horses and a different way of fighting, but they also brought a habit that would define Westeros for thousands of years. Once they found the land useful, they stayed, claimed it, and built their own memory on top of whatever had been there before. The earliest conflict was not a clean conquest. The first men cleared forests, hunted, farmed, and pushed outward. The children answered with the tools they had, using the terrain itself as a weapon. Their war was long because neither side had an easy way to finish it. The first men were stronger in open battle and better at settling territory. The children knew the deeper country and could make every road, crossing, and camp feel costly. Over time, the war turned into exhaustion. That is what makes the pact so important. It was not a victory parade for either side. It was a compromise forced by reality, and it changed Westeros more than any single battle from this age. The pact also explains why the North is so different from the rest of the continent. The agreement was sealed on the Isle of Faces, and from it came a fragile balance between peoples who had spent generations trying to drive each other out. The children kept their sacred groves and much of their old presence in the far north and in hidden places, while the first men remained the dominant human population. Over time, the two groups mixed in limited ways, and the first men began to adapt instead of simply advance. They learned the land, named it, and built identities around it. That is where the idea of Westerosi civilization really starts, not with a throne, but with survival and settlement. From there, the old world of Westeros becomes less like a single kingdom and more like a patchwork of regional powers. There are no unified crowns yet, only local kings, hill lords, forest rulers, and coastal raiders trying to hold what they can. In the north, the first men establish long-lasting traditions that survive even after other regions change beyond recognition. In the south, smaller kingdoms rise and fall faster because the land is more open and more contested. The stories from this age are the ones later generations remember as legend: warrior kings, great builders, oath-bound founders, and families that claim descent from figures who may be half history and half myth. This is also the age when the idea of noble blood starts to matter. Once a family has held land long enough, its rule turns into tradition. Once tradition lasts long enough, it turns into legitimacy. That process is slow, but it is crucial. The houses that dominate later history do not appear out of nowhere. They grow out of this early period of conquest, settlement, and memory. Some lines will claim direct descent from the first men, others will rise later and inherit the old stories. Either way, power in Westeros begins with land, then becomes custom, and only much later becomes law. What makes this era so important is that it leaves behind problems that never fully go away. The first men do not erase the older world. The children do not disappear cleanly. The land itself forces a compromise, and that compromise becomes the model for everything that follows: conflict first, settlement second, peace only when both sides are too tired to continue. By the time this age ends, Westeros is no longer a land of strangers. It is a continent divided between ancient peoples, with boundaries shaped by war and a balance held together by necessity. That uneasy order is the ground on which the next great age begins. After the first settlement and the long struggle between the first men and the children of the forest, Westeros does not suddenly become orderly. It becomes remembered. That is the difference this age introduces. The earliest wars fade into oral tradition, and the people who come after them begin turning uncertain history into origin stories. This is the Age of Heroes, the period when later Westerosi identity starts to take shape through legend, family pride, and the need to explain why certain houses mattered more than others. Most of what survives from this era is not reliable history in the modern sense. It is a mixture of regional memory, courtly story, and later invention. But even those stories tell us something real. They show a continent where power had started to settle into families and places. A house could claim an ancient founder, a sacred blade, a pact with the old powers of the land, or a deed that supposedly shaped an entire kingdom. Whether every detail is true is less important than the effect. These tales gave later rulers a past large enough to justify present authority. In the north, the old stories are generally treated with more respect because northern culture preserves memory differently. The Stark line is tied to the idea of ancient kingship at Winterfell, and the tales of Bran the Builder place the first great northern order in the hands of a figure who is half king, half legend. He is credited in tradition with building Winterfell and the Wall, though the exact truth behind those claims is impossible to prove. That is typical of the Age of Heroes. The names matter because they connect families to institutions that still exist. If a story says a house raised a castle or founded a holdfast, it gives that house a claim that reaches far beyond simple conquest. Other regions preserve similar founding figures. The Grey Kings of the Iron Islands, the Marsh Kings of the Neck, the Gardeners of the Reach, and the Storm Kings of the Stormlands all belong to this broad early pattern of local rule. Westeros is no longer just a land of scattered clans. It is forming into recognizable kingdoms, each with its own customs and ruling lines. But these are not centralized states yet. They are loose realms held together by force, marriage, tribute, and reputation. A king is still mostly the strongest local lord whose story has spread farther than his rivals. That is why the Age of Heroes matters to the larger history of Westeros. It creates the myths later dynasties used to define themselves. A ruler does not simply want land, he wants continuity. He wants to say that his rule was foretold, inherited, or earned by some ancient deed. The problem is that these legends are not stable enough to settle disputes forever. Different regions remember different heroes, and different houses tell the same old story in ways that flatter themselves. So the Age gives Westeros a shared past, but not a shared truth. It also shows how thin civilization still is. These early kingdoms are vulnerable to collapse, raiding, famine, and outside pressure. They depend on strong individuals and fragile lines of inheritance. When a ruler dies without a clear successor, his kingdom can break apart. When a house loses its best warriors, its neighbors close in. The continent is developing noble traditions, but those traditions are still tied to personal strength and local dominance, not to any lasting central authority. By the end of this era, Westeros has recognizable great houses, ancient seats, and the first outlines of regional identity. The north remembers builders and kings. The south remembers conquerors, saints of a sort, and old bloodlines. Yet all of it is still rooted in myth more than record, and in local power more than law. That is what makes the next catastrophe so important, because once the legends are in place, the world that follows will be forced to measure itself against them. The Age of Heroes did not last because Westeros became stable. It lasted because people kept telling its stories after the world nearly broke. That pattern becomes even more important once the long night begins, because now the continent is not just dealing with war, migration, or rival kingdoms. It is facing the kind of disaster that can erase memory itself. The long night is remembered as the age when winter was not a season but a catastrophe. Darkness spread for years, cold drove crops to failure, and famine followed. In the old stories, the others came with that cold, bringing dead things back into motion and turning the ordinary fear of winter into something far worse. Whether every detail of those legends survives exactly as it happened is impossible to prove, but the broad shape of the tale matters. Westeros believed it had faced a threat that could not be met by armies alone. That is where the Night's Watch enters history. The order is tied to the end of the Long Night and to the defense of the Wall, which itself became the clearest answer Westeros ever built to an ancient terror. The Watch was created to stand apart from the quarrels of kings and great houses, because the danger in the north was supposed to be bigger than politics. Its purpose was simple in theory and hard in practice. Hold the wall, watch the lands beyond it, and keep the realm from forgetting what had happened the last time the world went dark. The Wall is one of the most important inheritances in all of Westerosi history, because it shows how a civilization responds when survival comes before glory. A kingdom can lose territory and later take it back. It can replace a dynasty. It can survive rebellion. But a wall built against the unknown says something deeper. It means the people who built it believed the threat might return, and that ordinary borders were not enough. In that sense, the end of the Long Night did not simply close a chapter, it changed the shape of the continent. Just as important, the aftermath of that age reshaped the North. Northern identity becomes tied to endurance, to old duties, and to the memory of hardship. The stories of the Starks, the Builders, and the First Watch all grow out of that same background. Even where the details blur, the lesson remains clear. The North was formed by living closest to the cold and by taking the threat from beyond the walls seriously long before the rest of Westeros wanted to. The Long Night also changes religion and belief. Different regions draw different meanings from the disaster, and later ages will argue over what was literal history and what became sacred story. But the effect is undeniable. People who survive a catastrophe like that do not look at winter the same way again. They pass down warnings. They create vows. They keep faith with old defenses. In the centuries after, the wall becomes more than a frontier. It becomes a reminder that Westeros has already faced extinction once and only barely held together. That is why the Long Night matters so much in the larger history of Westeros. It is the first event that makes survival itself part of the continent's identity. The kingdoms that follow will fight over crowns, castles, and succession, but all of them inherit a world that was already forced to learn how fragile it is, and at the center of that memory stands the wall, not as a symbol of victory, but as proof that the unknown was real, the cost was enormous, and the realm only endured by building something meant to outlast fear. After the Long Night, Westeros does not return to a single, settled order. It becomes a continent of memories, local loyalties, and old boundaries. And that matters because the next great change does not simply add a new ruling family on top of the old world. It replaces much of the old world altogether. The invasion of the Andals is one of the most important turning points in Westerosi history because it transforms the south, reshapes religion, changes the noble class, and leaves only the far north and a few isolated places outside its reach. If the Dawn Age and the Long Night explain how Westeros survived, the coming of the Andals explains why the continent later looks the way it does. The Andals arrive from across the narrow sea in waves over many generations, not as one neat conquest, but as a long pressure on the older kingdoms. They bring iron weapons, mounted warfare, and most importantly, the faith of the Seven. Their advance does not look the same everywhere. In some regions, they conquer outright. In others, they settle, marry into existing lines, and absorb local customs until the difference between invader and native becomes harder to see. That slow blending is part of why the story of the Andals is so central to Westeros. They do not just defeat enemies, they overwrite memory, language, belief, and rule. In the south, the old First Men kingdoms are gradually broken apart. The Riverlands, the Vale, the Stormlands, and parts of the Reach all feel the pressure of Andal expansion. Old dynasties fall, new houses rise, and many of the names that survive into later history are the result of that process of replacement rather than pure continuity. Some First Men bloodlines endure, but often under Andal customs or alongside the new faith. The old gods remain strongest in the north, where distance and climate give the Starks and their bannermen room to preserve older traditions. Elsewhere, the Andals establish the tone of politics that will define the rest of Westerosi history. Noble legitimacy tied to conquest, land, marriage, and religion all at once. The faith of the Seven becomes just as important as the swords that carry it. It gives the southern kingdoms a shared religious language, a priesthood, and a moral structure that can support rule. This is not just a matter of private belief. The faith helps knit together scattered realms and provides a common identity that can survive the fall of individual kings. It also creates new tensions, because religion in Westeros is never separate from power. Lords who accept the faith gain legitimacy in the south. Lords who resist it become reminders of an older order. By the time the Andal invasions have run their course, the south is no longer a patchwork of purely First Men kingdoms. It is a continent where Andal culture has become the dominant standard. The Age of Heroes still sits in the background of this period, and that is important too. Many of the great stories attached to the old houses are rooted in much older traditions, but the Andal era gives them sharper political meaning. Houses begin to define themselves not only by ancestry, but by which traditions they preserve, which gods they honor, and which regions they can hold. The old legends become part of noble identity. A line that claims descent from ancient kings gains prestige even when the details are impossible to verify. In Westeros, that kind of claim matters, because history is not only remembered, it is used. By the time the Andal invasions settle into a new balance, Westeros is no longer one simple world with one inherited order. It is a continent divided between different cultures that have been fighting, blending, and adapting for centuries. The north remains stubbornly older in its customs, the south is increasingly Andal in faith and rule, and in between, local houses preserve whatever mix of tradition, conquest, and compromise lets them survive. That is the shape of the world that will later be inherited by the Targaryens. Before dragons ever arrive, Westeros has already been divided and remade by migration, conquest, and the long struggle to turn war into permanence. The Targaryen story begins with a clean break from what came before. For centuries, Westeros was a patchwork of local powers, regional customs, and ruling families whose reach rarely extended far beyond their own borders. House Targaryen arrived with dragons, and that changed the scale of politics at once. Castles that had once seemed secure could be burned, armies could be broken, and kingdoms that had stood for generations could be forced to bend in a single campaign. Aegon's conquest is the point where Westeros stops being a set of separate realms and starts becoming one political order. Aegon, with Rhaenys and Visenya, did not simply take a throne that already existed. He created a new idea of kingship for the continent. Harrenhal shows why his campaign mattered so much. It was built to be nearly unassailable, yet dragons made its walls meaningless. The Field of Fire showed the same truth on a larger scale. Even a great host could collapse when dragonfire turned battle into terror. Westerosi conquest had always depended on banners, bloodlines, and the ability to hold ground. Aegon added a weapon no one else could answer. Dawn was the major exception, and that exception matters. It shows the limits of dragon rule. The Targaryens could destroy castles and win battles, but they could not always impose a lasting settlement by force alone. Dawn resisted direct conquest for generations, using terrain, mobility, and endurance to outlast the dragons. It eventually entered the realm through diplomacy and marriage, rather than outright defeat. That difference is important because it proves the Seven Kingdoms were never unified by military power alone. Some regions were conquered, others were brought in through negotiation. Westeros was becoming one kingdom, but not through one method. Once Aegon wore the crown, the Iron Throne became the symbol of that new reality. It was not just a seat of government, it was forged from the swords of defeated enemies, a reminder that rule now rested on conquest and submission. King's Landing became the political center of Westeros, and over time the crown became the place where the continent's rival traditions had to answer to one authority. That did not erase local power, but it did place it inside a hierarchy. Great houses still ruled their lands, but they now did so under a royal system that could reward, punish, and intervene. That is where the dynasty shifts from conquest to rule, and from rule to instability. The early Targaryen kings relied on dragons to hold the realm together, but dragons were never a permanent foundation. As long as the family stayed united and its dragons remained strong, the throne looked secure. When those conditions weakened, Westeros returned to its old habits: powerful houses, competing claims, and regions that remembered they had once governed themselves. Those tensions explode in the Dance of the Dragons, the civil war that shows how fragile dragon rule really was. For the first time, the ruling house turns on itself in open conflict, and the dragons meant to preserve unity become tools of destruction. The scale of the loss matters as much as the outcome. The Targaryens keep the throne, but the dynasty comes out weaker. The dragons are dying out, and the realm learns that royal blood alone does not guarantee control. From that point on, Targaryen power still exists, but it is no longer effortless. What follows is a slow decline from the height of dragon rule, even when the surface of the realm looks stable. The Targaryens continue to govern, but their authority depends more and more on marriage, alliance, and careful handling of noble rivals. Rebellion, succession disputes, and internal distrust do more damage than foreign enemies ever could. Older loyalties never fully disappear, especially in regions that had once known independence, and that memory stays alive inside the politics of the crown. By the later Targaryen period, the great houses are no longer just regional lords under a dragon lord's shadow. They are political forces strong enough to shape the fate of kings. That becomes fatal once the dynasty begins to fracture for good. Civil wars and succession crises reduce the royal line and hollow out its authority over generations. By the time the main story begins, Westeros still has a king, but it is no longer the kingdom the Targaryens built. The old order remains in name, yet the unity behind it has already been worn away. That is the larger arc of Westerosi history under the Targaryens. Conquest brought the continent under one crown, but it did not erase the divisions underneath it. Civil war exposed how fragile that unity could be, and decline made the realm increasingly dependent on habit, fear, and memory. From Aegon's Landing to the present, Westeros is still one kingdom, but it has never stopped carrying the weight of the separate lands it came from. And that is what makes Westeros easier to understand than it first appears. Its history is not a straight line of progress, but a repeating pattern. Kingdoms are broken, rebuilt, challenged, and broken again. The first men arrive and are pushed back or absorbed. The Andals conquer through faith and steel. The Targaryens unite the continent, then lose that unity to succession, rebellion, and decay. Each age leaves something behind, and none of them fully erase what came before. That is why the present day is so unstable. The crown sits on top of older borders, older claims, older grudges, and older memories that never truly died. Westeros survives because it has survived before, but it also keeps collapsing along the same fault lines. Its history is the story of invasion, endurance, and fracture, and every new conflict is only the latest layer of that long, unfinished struggle.